Now, I'm sure some of you have been waiting for this video for a couple of days now, ever since the Chicago Bears traded up to the second overall pick in the 2017 NFL Draft this past Thursday night to select Mitchell or Mitch Trubisky, whatever the hell he wants to go by, the quarterback from North Carolina. And you've been waiting, and here it is. And all I have to say is I pose this question. Mitch Trubisky, the hell was Ryan Pace thinking? Now, in the interest of fairness, I think it's appropriate to provide some necessary context to what may have went into this decision. As I talk about so often, you have to have a quarterback to win a championship. Furthermore, the majority of championship contending teams year in and year out now in the NFL draft and develop their own quarterback. A lot of times quarterbacks that they drafted in the first round. There's so much empirical data that clearly indicates how important this is. And you know when you're in the midst of a rebuilding project like the Chicago Bears are, that you have to get a young quarterback to actually begin and progress along that path of rebuilding. Until you get that young quarterback, everything else is just window dressing. You're just killing time. It doesn't officially begin until you get that young quarterback, because the quarterback has to be the franchise guy. He has to be the centerpiece. He's the guy that you have to build everything around: offense, defense, special teams, coaching staff, all of that. You have to get that quarterback. And when you look at the Chicago Bears as an organization, they have a long, mostly crappy history at the quarterback position. You know, Sid Luckman isn't coming out from beyond the grave and walking through the doors of Hallis Hall anytime soon. You have a lot of other bad quarterback play, an occasional glimmer of hope in a Super Bowl championship with Jim McMahon, and then some largely overrated years from Jay Cutler. And a lot of crap in between. My apologies to Bill Wade and his '63 championship team. And especially coming off of the heels of the disaster that was the 8 years of the Jay Cutler experience, knowing that this team, because they lacked the confidence and ability to properly evaluate quarterbacks, they decided to go out and get somebody else's and try to make them their own, and then stubbornly stuck by him and stubbornly stuck by him, and he ruined one front office and one head coach, then ruined another front office and another head coach, and you got to the point where he was about to do it to a third one. Now, after the 2016 season, the Bears are sitting there with the third overall pick. They're in a marquee draft position where they have the ability, the potential to get that young franchise type of quarterback. And just because they signed Mike Glennon in free agency, in no way, shape, or form was going to preclude them from drafting a quarterback high, nor should it have. Because the money that they gave to Mike Glennon, it was like super duper high backup, very low end starter money. And based off of the amount of salary cap space the Bears had, they had to spend that money on somebody anyways. And at the end of the day, Mike Glennon is basically on a 1-year deal in terms of the way the guaranteed money is very front loaded and it's structured, the deal itself. So when you look at the history of the Bears coming off of the Jay Cutler disaster and the waste of time that 8 seasons was, the fact that even with Mike Glennon in the fold, even if you have confidence in the guy, he's still only on a 1-year deal. Combined with the marquee draft position that the Bears were sitting in, you can understand the temptation was going to be very, very high for the Bears to not want to punt the ball down the road anymore and to find that guy in the 2017 draft and ultimately take him. So there's some rationale, some logic for the thought process here. But then the NFL draft actually happened. And to me, once you started hearing some of the buzz about the Browns were thinking about Mitchell Trubisky, they might take Mitch Trubisky. You know, now when you look back, but even at the time, it kind of seemed like it was an attempt to get somebody to bite. It was an attempt to get somebody to be desperate enough to trade up. The Browns are just basically sitting there and playing out other options, which when you have the number 1 overall pick, why the hell wouldn't you? What does it hurt to do so? If you know the guy you want to take all along anyways, why not see what options are out there? Because if you get to the point where the offer is so extreme that you feel like you have no choice but to take it, then you have to take it. But ultimately, nobody was desperate enough to go up to the number 1 overall pick to select Mitch Trubisky. The Browns clearly had no intentions of ever taking him number 1 overall, because if they did, they ultimately would have. So they took Myles Garrett, which was the right decision for them based off of the situation and the circumstance of the Cleveland Browns. And I think what it was is once this happened, Ryan Pace got too excited. It was one of these situations where it's December 24th, it's Christmas Eve night. A lot of the gifts are under the tree. Maybe the Santa gifts aren't there yet, but you've got enough of the gifts under the tree. As a kid, you're starting to think about what those gifts could potentially be, and you just can't wait to open them. And you probably try to sneak down that night and open a couple of the presents because you just can't wait. That excitement just kills you because you're so close. You're not there yet, but it's so close, you can't stand it. You give up life and limb to be able to get that instant gratification. And to me, that's what it felt like here with Ryan Pace. The anxiousness, the nervousness, the anticipation got to be too much, where clearly he had a hard on for Mitchell Trubisky to the point where it got to number 2 in the San Francisco 49ers, and Ryan Pace had determined that Trubisky was too important to him, and they needed him and wanted him too damn bad, and he was going to do whatever it took to ultimately get him. And it's crazy because when you really look at the big picture of it, especially with the reporting you got from Peter King after the draft, but even really with the draft itself, you hear a lot of thought about San Francisco potentially wanting to get into the Kirk Cousins market and so on. When all is said and done, the Bears really traded up to get a guy at number 2 that they would have gotten at number 3 anyways. And I know some people are going to sit there and say, well, the 49ers had another offer. They had a bull. And I'll tell you why. Because if they would have had another offer, it would have required a team to give up more draft picks, which the 49ers would have been hard-pressed to turn down. And as a result, they would have taken that damn deal, period. And if you think anything other than that, you're a moron. If the San Francisco 49ers would have had another concrete offer from anybody else, it would have been a better offer, and they ultimately would have taken it. And what's really troubling about this is we could talk about the lack of quality of the organizations in Cleveland and San Francisco. But these were two incredibly quarterback-needy, quarterback-desperate organizations. And with having the first 2 picks in the draft, if either one of these teams ultimately felt that Mitchell Trubisky or any of the other quarterbacks in this draft was potentially a franchise guy, you know what they would have done? They would have taken him at pick number 1 or pick number 2. If the Cleveland Browns really felt that Mitch Trubisky or Patrick Mahomes or Deshaun Watson was a franchise quarterback, then you take him over Myles Garrett 100 out of 100 times. And if you don't agree with that, you as well are a moron. Because you could have an all-pro defensive end, and that's great. But that franchise quarterback is worth so many more times its weight in gold. And that's a fact. Because organizations spend decades looking for that franchise guy. And in the grand scheme of things, the Chicago Bears have invested first-round picks via trade, Rick Meyer, first-round picks via drafting, Rex Grossman, Jim McMahon, Jim Harbaugh over the years, to try and find that franchise quarterback that they really truly haven't had since going back to the days of the T formation, those dominant Bears teams of the 40s. That's how important the franchise quarterback is. Yet Cleveland and San Francisco both pass on this guy. That should have been the warning sign for Ryan Pace in the Chicago Bears front office. If he was that good and he was that talented, why would the San Francisco 49ers want to peel out of that spot? Why would the Cleveland Browns have passed on the dude? And you can sit there and talk about the fact of, well, these were bad organizations and they're drafting where they were for a reason. Hey, newsflash, the Bears are picking 3rd overall. They're not in a whole hell of a lot of better place at this point in time, if we're being perfectly honest. And they didn't have nearly the draft pick capital in this draft that the Cleveland Browns did to potentially create some type of immediate improvement for their organization in 2017 and going forward. And if you're the Bears as well, nobody traded up to number 1 or nobody traded up to number 2. Especially for the 49ers, they were desperate to trade down. That was true. They wanted to trade down. And nobody else did. That should have told you something. You could do 2 things in the draft. You can either play the draft game or the draft game can play you. And in my opinion, in this particular case, Ryan Pace clearly got played by the draft game. And what happened as a result was he ended up giving up 3 mid-round picks, not even containing the damage all in one draft class. He gave up a 3rd and 4th rounder in 2017 and a 3rd rounder in 2018 to move up from 3 to 2. You're killing me, Smalls. As the shirt says, you're killing me. Now, granted, some of you are going to throw it back in my face of some of the things I've said over the years, that if you feel like you got the guy, you pay the price and you go get him because, again, it will be worth its weight in gold and so much more. And that is true. But again, when you look at the circumstances and situations, shouldn't that be a warning sign that Cleveland and San Francisco did not want to take the guy and ultimately did not? And that nobody else was desperate enough to get that dude to the point where they would trade up ahead of Chicago, knowing that there was a chance that Chicago might be infatuated with Trubisky? That should set off warning signs. It absolutely should. And in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the way the draft played out, how ridiculous is it that the Chicago Bears gave up 3 mid-round picks, a third and fourth rounder in 2017, a third rounder in 2018, just to move up from 3 to 2 to get a guy in no way, shape, or form for anybody other than the Chicago Bears I can imagine had this guy as the #1 player on the board. Many of those teams, in fact, did not even have Trubisky as the #1 quarterback on their board. And when you look at the way the draft played out, what is so different between Mitchell Trubisky and DeShone Kizer to where the Chicago Bears can logically justify to themselves as an organization that he was taken, Trubisky, 50 picks ahead of Kizer in this draft? That's insanity, especially when you look at Mitch Trubisky, the prospect. This is a guy, I know it's been talked about a lot, but it's a valid question. He couldn't beat out Marquise Williams at UNC, and you can give me all this talk about, well, he was a good college quarterback. Bullshit. At the end of the day, if Trubisky was that damn good and he was that damn talented, no offense to Marquise Williams, but he would have found his ass on the fucking pine, period. You're talking about a guy who is a one-year starter, and sure, you have guys occasionally, like a Cam Newton, who were one-year starters, and they become franchise guys, but for a Cam Newton, there is a Mark Sanchez, and there's so many other guys. You're talking about bringing in a kid with very little high-level football experience. Furthermore, of course, leave it to the Chicago Bears to want to take a franchise quarterback and trade up to get him, and he's all of 6'2". Most teams usually, when they want to take a franchise quarterback that high, try to get a guy that's 6'4", 6'5", not the Chicago Bears. Now, at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that Trubisky can't play because he's 6'2". I'm just saying, sometimes size matters. But when you look at him as a prospect, he's a decent athlete. He's got some mobility. He's got some ability to run with the ball. He's got the ability to improvise, which is nice. And he can make some real money throws. He's a really accurate passer. So that's a nice trait to have. But that's a lot of the same things we were saying about Jared Goff in the 2016 draft class. But he only has adequate arm strength. His arm is most certainly not special. And I'm sorry, to take a quarterback that high, he needs to have close to, if not special arm talent, and needs to have big-time arm strength. And Trubisky has some arm talent, but it's not elite arm talent, because if he had elite arm talent, the Browns or somebody else would have taken him at #1, or the 49ers or somebody else would have taken him at #2, not the Chicago Bears. Questionable pocket presence with a really bad habit to sit there and turn his back on the pass rush. Sound familiar, Chicago? Sexy Raxy. A tendency to lock onto his primary target. Really sporadic field vision. Sound familiar? Jay Cutler. Also a tendency to run hot and cold. And if he struggles early, it can really affect him, and he struggles to rebound. That should sound really familiar, Chicago. And in the grand scheme of things, in a quarterback class that people were talking about for a long time wasn't that good. And a lot of teams felt like quarterbacks were going to go early, but they didn't necessarily deserve to go early in a draft that was pretty good, especially at other positions like running back and tight end, and in the secondary, both corner and safety. The Chicago Bears, a third overall pick, instead of sitting there at #3 and taking an impact player, or even better, potentially finding somebody else desperate to trade up for somebody and trying to maybe peel back down the board, they decide they're going to fucking trade up for a guy who very well could end up not being the best quarterback out of this draft class. If I was going to trade up for anybody at this point, I would have done Patrick Mahomes, because he has special arm talent that Trubisky just doesn't. And in the grand scheme of things, what's really got to be concerning about all this is that trading up for quarterbacks in round #1 is far from an exact science and far from a sure thing, and more often than not proves to be disastrous for the organization that traded up to get the quarterback. For example, I'll use recent history since 1998. Since 1998, there have been 19 times that a team has traded up in some configuration, way, shape, or form in round one to get a quarterback. Sometimes that means just moving up one spot. Sometimes that means moving up a few spots. Sometimes that means moving way up in round one. Sometimes that means trading a future one or a 2 and a 3 in that draft to get back into the first round. Let me give you the names of every quarterback since 1998 that a team has traded up for in round number one. I'll begin now. Ryan Leaf, Michael Vick, Kyle Bowler, Eli Manning, J.P. Losman, Jason Campbell, Jay Cutler, Brady Quinn, Joe Flacco, Mark Sanchez, Josh Freeman, Tim Tebow, Blaine Gabbert, RG3, Johnny Manziel, Teddy Bridgewater, Jared Goff, Carson Wentz, Paxton Lynch. 19 guys. And a lot of those names are flat out bust. Think about that. The Broncos once traded up to get Tim Tebow. The Buccaneers once traded up to get Josh Freeman. The Jets once traded up to get Mark Sanchez. There's an awful lot of busts here. And I know some people are going to sit there and probably say, well, it's a different draft, it's a different circumstance, no two drafts, no two players are ever the same. And maybe that's true. But at some point in time, there becomes enough of a trend or enough of a pattern where you have to really say mover or buyer beware. Because out of all of these quarterbacks where a team traded up in round one to get him, how many of them really panned out? Ryan Leaf was a disaster, but at least when you go back to the 98 draft, there was a legitimate debate about whether Peyton Manning or Ryan Leaf was going to be the best quarterback in that draft. And most everybody thought they were going to go 1-2. Nobody really looked at Mitchell Trubisky and thought he should be a top 3 pick in this draft. And if they did, frankly, they were kind of crazy. You want to say, well, Michael Vick worked out. Kind of. He did. But the San Diego Chargers were able to peel back in that 2001 draft from 1-5 and get LaDainian Tomlinson, and then they got Drew Brees with the first pick of round 2. I would surmise that ultimately the Chargers won that one and won that one big, because the Chargers in that draft drafted 2 Hall of Fame players, even though you could say Brees became the Hall of Famer when he went to New Orleans. But LT ended up going to the Hall of Fame, and he's there already, and Vic never will be, even though he should have been. So, and on the one hand, it worked, but think about all the picks and players Atlanta gave up to move up. Imagine if they maybe would have just stayed put and gotten LT and Drew Brees, how much better the Atlanta Falcons organization would have been. Kyle Bowler busted, and even if you want to say in 2004, well, the Giants traded up from 4-1 to get Eli Manning, and they won 2 Super Bowls, so in theory, that works, yes. But everybody knows that Eli was only the 3rd best quarterback out of that 2004 great draft class with Phillip Rivers and Big Ben. Imagine if the Giants would have just kept Phillip Rivers and not had to give up the 2nd round pick in that 04 draft, been able to keep their 1st round pick in 2005. Not only would they have had more quality commodity draft picks, they would also had the better quarterback. Maybe the Giants win 3 or 4 Super Bowls with Phillip Rivers instead of the 2 they've won with Eli Manning. J.P. Losman bust, Jason Campbell bust. The bottom line is one of the best examples of a team being somewhat successful trading up in round 1 for a quarterback is Jay Cutler. You know you got issues, and he lasted all of 3 years in damn Denver anyways. Joe Flacco is as good of an example of anybody at this actually working, and that was 2008. That was a damn decade ago. Even if I want to say somebody like a Carson Wentz, as much as you can call me a Carson Wentz nut hugger, at the end of the day, he's only been in the league 1 year. Can't sit there and crown him as Jesus Christ just yet. Just think about that. All of these times, all of these examples, it's similar to wide receivers from USC. Every year you see it. It's like another guy comes out of the draft, and every year these guys get pumped full of smoke in terms of their draft prospects, whether it's Robert Woods or it's Marquise Lee or it's Nelson Aguilar or this year Juju Smith-Schuster, and previously guys like Mike Williams and Dwayne Jarrett, Kerry Colbert, Steve Smith, blah, 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 blah. And at some point in time, enough of those guys bust out, enough of those guys don't become what they're supposed to be at the NFL level, that there should be an indication that it's dangerous to draft a UFC wide receiver because they could be a product of the system, and they all are very similar in some ways, and they usually don't pan out. So why would you invest a high draft pick in a USC wide receiver? If it's 1 or 2, that's one thing, but when it's 7, 8, 9 guys over a certain period of time that all bust out for the most part when they get to the NFL, that should be a real pause for concern. And when you're talking about trading up in the first round to get a quarterback, and you see this many examples of bust and guys that flamed out, what was it? In a lot of cases, it was teams desperate for a quarterback, so they wanted somebody to be something that they ultimately weren't. In some cases, it was just bad evaluations, period. Some of it was also that when you did get a guy, you were talking about bad organizations making these moves, so that compounded the problem some. And then the loss of draft resources by going up to get these quarterbacks really hindered you in those following years to be able to surround them with young talent that quarterback could grow and develop with, and that could help protect that quarterback. So it's a wide variety of factors. But when you look at that, what is so different about Mitchell Trubisky and the Chicago Bears doing what they did as opposed to so many of these other situations? The evidence is clearly there to indicate that more likely than not, Mitchell Trubisky is going to be a bust at the NFL. And when this all happened, this really reminded me, and I was afraid in part that the Bears are going to end up doing this. This reminds me a lot of Jacksonville taking Blake Bortles out of fucking nowhere with the third pick in 2014. The difference being, though, is as bad as that selection was and as bad as of a reach as that was, at least the Jaguars didn't have to trade up to get Blake Bortles. They just reached for him within their own draft spot. The Chicago Bears overplayed their hand so much and panicked so damn much that they had to trade up to massively reach for a freaking quarterback. And it's crazy. I just don't get at the end of the day Ryan Pace's thought process here. There's not much franchise quarterback buzz. And even when they're showing the videos talk about how Trubisky was his number one quarterback, Donald Loggins was his number one quarterback, this guy was his number one quarterback, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, John Fox wasn't one of them. Just because a guy is the number one quarterback, that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. You could be the top performer in a class of 100 people where 99 of those people get C's and you get a C plus. Yes, in theory, you're the top student. Yes, in theory, if you average that out, that makes you a valedictorian. But that doesn't mean you're very good. You're still average. That's not necessarily a great way to evaluate the position, is to say, well, everybody in the building thinks this is the top guy. Well, if he's the top guy in a weaker class, that still makes him not as good and not worth that draft selection. Just because you needed to, just because you wanted to, just like because in some ways you felt like you had to, doesn't mean that you needed to draft a quarterback here, and it most certainly doesn't mean you needed to draft this quarterback in these circumstances, in this situation. Of course, that's what I get for all these years talking about how the Bears have to draft a young quarterback or else it doesn't matter. Well, lo and behold, that's what they did. Ha ha ha, up my ass. And what I think is the Chicago Bears could really live to regret this with the number of picks that they gave up that could have been used for pieces on that offense that isn't very good to surround their young quarterback Trubisky with some help. When you look ahead to the next year's draft class in 2018, fact is, even if a couple of guys get hit by buses, that quarterback class is going to be so far superior to what the 2017 class was. So leave it to the Chicago Bears to reach for a guy in a weaker quarterback class when they could have potentially stood pat or even traded down in 2018 and still got a potential franchise quarterback with more upside than Mitchell Trubisky. The way it looks right now, this pick was dumb. And the whole circumstance of how everything broke down indicates a general manager who panicked and frankly is in a bit over his head. When you hear reports of John Fox not knowing that this would probably be the pick until a few hours before the draft, that suggests the general manager and the head coach are not on the same page. That's not a good thing whatsoever. Furthermore, that's indicating that the general manager has politically positioned himself into a high place of power in the McCaskey family, which again, as we know, is not necessarily a good thing either. See Ted Phillips. It just feels like it's going to be a disaster. It just feels like this was dumb. As I compared Mitchell Trubisky to Andy Dalton is the type of guy that you can win some games with. Occasionally, maybe you win a game because of, but you're not going to win big games because of him. And that's why I look at Trubisky. I think he has NFL starting potential, but I think it's more of in the 12 to 16 or 12 to 18 ranking in terms of NFL quarterbacks. And that's not the type of guy I'm trying to take with the second overall pick, period. And with as many teams out there openly questioning what the hell the Chicago Bears did, and just a unanimous "what the fuck are you doing?" Again, very similar to 2014 with the Jacksonville Jaguars. Sometimes people are wrong. Like there was a strong narrative about what the hell were the Falcons doing in 2008 when they drafted Matt Ryan, and people were wrong. But generally, if that many people are that thrown off by it, especially when it comes to a quarterback, and that many people are shocked by it, and that many people are questioning it, that is not a good indicator of potential future success. I think this was ridiculously idiotic by Ryan Pace, and this could be what ends up costing him and a lot of other people in that organization their jobs in the next couple of years. One way or another, this draft selection by Ryan Pace and the Chicago Bears is a franchise and organization changer. There's no question. Because if Trubisky does become that dude somehow, some way, then the Bears are a much different type of team. And if he doesn't, then it's just going to be more wasted years, and then a new regime is going to be looking to start over again. And with that said, as much as I'm not a fan of the selection of Mitchell Trubisky, as much as I think Ryan Pace got played like a fiddle, as idiotic as I think it is to trade up that much just to move up one spot to take the guy that probably was going to be there at 3, and especially knowing that the teams in front of you, the first one didn't draft him, the second one's willing to listen to an offer to trade down. Again, if this dude was that much of a franchise quarterback, if Cleveland and San Francisco didn't take him, especially Cleveland, getting kind of snake bit by the Carson Wentz decision last year, and nobody else traded up to 1 or 2 to get Trubisky, that should tell you something. I think it's going to end up being a disaster. I really, really do. Now, with that said, as much as I want to crap on this, and as much as I want to go flying off the handle, and in some ways feel like I did have the right to do so, I don't see where it's going to be very productive. Look, this will always kind of stick in my craw, and I just don't see it ending well. But it's already happened. The decision's been made. The selections happened. Now we have to hope for the best. We have to hope that Ryan Pace knew something that pretty much nobody else in the NFL knew. We have to hope that the price that they paid to move up one slot in the draft to get Trubisky was worth it. We have to hope that Trubisky's 1 year of experience in college isn't necessarily an indicator of potential problems with picking up and adjusting to the speed and the complexity of the NFL game. We have to hope that Trubisky can be that guy that can make money throws. We have to hope that he could be that dude that does this and does that and so on and so forth. Because what other choice do we have as Bears fans at this point? What are we going to do, root against the kid? What's that going to accomplish? Frankly, that's where I got with Jay Cutler the past few years. And all it was a waste of time. The most valuable commodity we have in life is time. And at this point in time, I do not want to waste my time by trying to sabotage Mitchell Trubisky and Ryan Pace. I hope to God this works out. I pray to God this works out. I want nothing more than in 3 or 4 years to Mitchell Trubisky to have truly proven to be that dude, to prove all of us wrong, have egg on all of our faces, and the Chicago Bears once again make a Super Bowl and this time actually hoist the Lombardi Trophy. That's what I hope. I want nothing more than for that to happen. But I can't say that I'm very optimistic that this selection is going to get him anywhere close to that point.